My wife has never read the Apocryphon of John. She doesn't know what the monad is. She doesn't know what Gnostic cosmology says about the nature of consciousness, or why early Christian councils spent centuries trying to erase a particular set of teachings from history. She's never heard the word pleroma used in a sentence that wasn't coming from me. And yet, I asked her to do something I'd been sitting with for weeks. I gave her no context, no framing, no vocabulary. I just described the basic structure of a practice, something that comes directly out of one of the oldest surviving Gnostic texts, and I asked her to do it, and then tell me what she noticed. What she described back to me stopped me cold. Not because it was dramatic, not because she had some overwhelming mystical experience she couldn't explain, but because she used different words to describe the exact same thing I had been trying to articulate for months. The same interior territory, the same shift, the same recognition. She had no map. She got to the same location. That matters. Not as a party trick, not as proof of anything supernatural. It matters because of what it says about where that territory actually is, and why the tradition that mapped it first was systematically buried. That's what this video is about. Most people who've spent any time in Gnostic material think they know what the monad is. They've read a summary somewhere. They've seen it described as the highest God, the supreme principle, the ineffable source above all sources. They've filed it away as a theological abstraction, the Gnostic version of what other traditions call the absolute, the Godhead, the ground of being. That's the version you were handed. And it's not wrong exactly. It's just incomplete in a way that makes it useless. Because treating the monad as a theological category, something you believe in the same way you believe in a historical event, completely misses what the Gnostic texts were actually pointing at. You don't learn about the monad the way you learn about the French Revolution. That's not gnosis. That's just a library card. Here's where the distinction starts to matter. The Apocryphon of John, one of the central surviving texts of Sethian Gnosticism, recovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, opens with one of the most striking descriptions of the monad ever written. It says, "The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is he who exists as God and Father of everything, the invisible one who is above everything, who exists as incorruption, which is in the pure light into which no eye can look." Read that again, slowly. Not a personality, not a lawgiver, not an entity that sits on a throne and receives petitions. A monarchy with nothing above it, meaning not a ruler over others, but a singularity that has no outside. Pure light that no eye can look into. Not because it's hiding, because the eye and the light are not separate things. This is where most introductions to the monad stop. They quote the text, they note how philosophically sophisticated it is, they compare it to Neoplatonism, and move on. What they don't tell you is that the Gnostic teachers weren't describing the monad so you could understand it academically. They were describing it so you could recognize it, in yourself, as yourself. That distinction is everything. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing his famous treatise against heresies around 180 CE, was furious at the Gnostic communities for exactly this reason. Not because they believed in a supreme principle, plenty of Orthodox theologians did too. He was furious because they were teaching that the divine source was something a human being could directly contact and identify with. That the relationship wasn't one of supplicant to sovereign, but something far more intimate and far more threatening to any institution that derives its authority from being the exclusive intermediary. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening, just saying. But here's what that version still leaves out. The monad in Sethian teaching isn't just the highest rung on a cosmic ladder you're supposed to climb toward. It's the ground of awareness itself. The texts describe it as the source from which all subsequent emanations, all the layered divine beings, all the cosmic structures, and eventually matter itself proceed. But here's the crucial part. Emanation in this framework doesn't mean departure. A ray of light doesn't leave the sun. The pleroma, the fullness, doesn't lose anything when consciousness extends into form. And you, in this framework, are not separate from that source. You are a point at which that awareness is looking at itself through a particular configuration of form and experience. That's not a metaphor they invented to make people feel better. That's the structural claim of the cosmology. And the practice they built around it, what I've been calling the monad call, is designed to do one thing: help you stop experiencing yourself as a distant observer looking toward the divine, and start recognizing what was never actually separate. Now, here's where it gets cosmically significant, because that shift from petition to recognition requires a completely different kind of inner move than anything most people have been taught. And understanding why requires us to look at what prayer actually does, structurally, to the person practicing it. I want to be careful here. I'm not attacking prayer as a practice, and I'm not dismissing the genuine experiences people have within it. What I'm doing is examining the structural logic of petition-based prayer, what it assumes about you and about the divine, because that assumption is exactly what the Gnostic tradition identified as the root problem. When you petition an external God, you are making a claim. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered the forgotten texts, the ones the Church sealed away for 17 centuries, into a single guide for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of the archons, the demiurge, or the divine spark, one truth remains: this knowledge was never meant to be lost. This is for anyone who senses there's more to this reality than we've been told, and who's ready to remember it. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that. You may not realize you're making it, but you are. The claim is this: I am here. The divine is there. There is a gap between us. And something I do, some words, some posture, some frequency of practice, some quality of sincerity, might cause the divine to reach across that gap and act on my behalf. That structure seems humble. It presents as devotion. But look at what it's actually encoding in the person who practices it daily, yearly, for decades. It encodes the gap as real. It makes the separation the foundational premise of the spiritual life. Every time you pray and petition, you reinforce at a very deep level the architecture of yourself as someone who does not inherently have access to the divine. You are a subject requesting audience with a sovereign. The Gnostic texts identified this as the signature of Archonic influence. Not because prayer is evil, but because the experience of radical separation from the divine source, the feeling that you are fundamentally outside of it, beneath it, awaiting its approval, is precisely the existential condition the demiurge and the archons maintain. As I covered in my video on the archons, you won't be judged after death. The archons do this instead. The mechanism isn't always force. Sometimes it's architecture. Sometimes it's the shape of the practice itself. The Pistis Sophia, one of the later and more elaborate Gnostic texts, probably composed in the 3rd century, deals extensively with the soul's confusion about its own nature. Pistis Sophia, whose name translates roughly as faith wisdom, is depicted as a divine being who has lost her place in the pleroma because she acted without her divine counterpart. She reached toward something she perceived as light without recognizing her own light. The entire narrative is about recovery, about a divine being relearning what it actually is. That's not an abstract myth, that's a map. The condition being described, reaching outward for a light you don't recognize as your own, is exactly what petition-based spiritual practice, at its worst, perpetuates. You keep reaching. The gap keeps being real. The reaching confirms the gap. Now here's where my own experience becomes relevant, and I want to be precise about what I mean. I was raised in a household where prayer was daily. Not oppressive, genuinely warm, genuinely sincere. My parents prayed with a depth of feeling that I respected, even when I later stopped sharing the theology behind it. But when I first encountered this Gnostic critique of petition prayer, probably 4 years into seriously reading these texts, something rattled loose. Because it didn't just challenge a religious habit, it challenged the entire interior architecture I had been building since childhood. The orientation of reaching outward, the assumption that whatever the divine is, it is fundamentally over there. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. And I tell you that not to frame this as a dramatic conversion story, but because the dismantling of that architecture is exactly what the monad call is designed to accomplish. Where prayer reinforces the experience of separation, the monad call operates on a completely different premise. It doesn't ask, it doesn't petition, it doesn't reach across a gap, it recognizes. And recognition in this framework is the only move that doesn't simultaneously reinforce the very condition you're trying to dissolve. So what does that actually look like? What is the monad call, structurally, practically, in terms of what you're actually doing when you do it? That's exactly what I want to get into. But first I need to establish something about the texts themselves, because the practice doesn't make full sense without understanding what the Gnostic teachers believed was happening cosmologically when a human being turned inward. Let me give you the cosmological frame, because without it, the monad call is just a breathing exercise with interesting branding. In Sethian Gnostic cosmology, and this is the branch of Gnosticism that produced the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and several other texts from the Nag Hammadi library. The universe is not a single-level creation made by a supreme and benevolent God. It's a layered emanation, and the layer we inhabit was not made by the highest source. Here's the structure. The monad, the highest principle, the pure light, the monarchy with nothing above it, generates, through a process of self-reflection and overflow, a series of divine eons. These eons are not separate beings exactly. They are aspects, facets, expressions of the pleroma, the fullness of divine reality. Think of them as the internal structure of infinite awareness becoming conscious of its own dimensions. At a certain point in this emanation, something goes wrong. One of these divine aspects, the Sophia, wisdom, acts independently, without the balance of her divine counterpart, and produces something unintended, an imperfect creator being, the demiurge. And the demiurge, who does not have full knowledge of what came before him, who actually believes himself to be the only God because he cannot see above himself, creates the material world. This matters enormously, because into that material world, the demiurge breathes consciousness, but the consciousness he breathes is not his to give. He breathed a spark of the pleroma into human beings without understanding what he was transmitting. The divine light that lives in you does not come from the demiurge. It came through him, but it originates in the monad. You are carrying something the demiurge didn't make and can't fully contain. The trimorphic protonoia, which is one of those texts I will never stop returning to. I spent 3 hours one night just sitting with its opening lines, makes this explicit in a way that is almost shocking in its directness. The text is written in the first person of a divine feminine principle, protonoia, who declares, "I am the movement that dwells in the all. I am the invisible one within the all." And this divine presence then describes descending into the world 3 times in 3 different forms, as voice, as speech, and finally as word, specifically to remind those who carry the spark of what they actually are. Think about what that structure implies. The divine doesn't need to be reached. It has already come toward you. It is already inside the structure of what you are. The recognition you're attempting isn't contact with something external, it's awareness of something already interior. This is why the Gnostic teachers were so threatening to the institutional church. It wasn't just that they had different theology, it was that their practice pointed to something no institution can mediate. You cannot be the gatekeeper to an interior reality. You cannot require membership for access to something that already lives inside the member. Valentinus, one of the most brilliant Gnostic theologians of the 2nd century, a man who came within a single vote of becoming Bishop of Rome, understood this and built an entire school around the practice of recognizing the interior light. His community used texts, contemplative practice, and symbolic ritual not to petition the divine, but to help initiates remember what the demiurge's world had trained them to forget. When his school was later branded as heretical and disbanded, it wasn't because his arguments were weak. His arguments were extraordinarily sophisticated. It was because what he was teaching made the institution structurally unnecessary. I personally think this is the most underrated dimension of the entire Gnostic controversy. Not the theology, not the cosmology, but the institutional threat. The teaching that the divine is interior is not just philosophically radical, it is economically and politically destabilizing to any religious structure built on exclusive mediation. That's my one editorial interjection. I'll move on. Now, here's where it gets cosmically significant. Because if the divine spark is already interior, if the trimorphic protonoia is right, that the invisible one is already within the all, already within you, then the question isn't how do you reach toward it? The question is, why do you keep experiencing yourself as separate from it? And what specific interior move do the Gnostic texts actually prescribe for dissolving that illusion? That's the monad call. And that's exactly where we're going next. So let's get precise about this. Because the monad call is not a chant. It's not a mantra in the way people loosely use that word. It is not a ritual formula you recite on a schedule, light a candle, wait for results. The Gnostic texts are not describing anything that resembles what most people picture when they hear the word spiritual practice. What they're describing is closer to an interior act of recognition, a specific movement of awareness that the texts treat as fundamentally different in kind from prayer, from petition, from any gesture that positions the practitioner as separate from the divine and reaching toward it. Here's where I want to bring in the Apocryphon of John, because this text is essential to understanding what the monad call is actually oriented toward. The text describes the monad, the supreme, ultimate source, using language that is deliberately paradoxical. It says the monad is immeasurable light, which is pure, holy, and immaculate. It is ineffable, being perfect in incorruptibility, not in perfection, nor in blessedness, nor in divinity, but in a thing that is far superior to these. Now, sit with that. The text is not saying the monad is the best of all known things. It is saying the monad exceeds the category of known things entirely. It's beyond perfection, beyond divinity as a concept, beyond blessedness as you might conceive it. And here is the crucial move the text makes immediately after. It says this monad, this thing beyond all categories, is what you came from, what you are an expression of, what the divine spark within you is made of. Not metaphorically, not symbolically in some poetic sense meant to make you feel good, literally, cosmologically, as a statement about the structure of reality. This is where the monad call diverges completely from prayer. Prayer, in most traditions, is addressed to something external, something that exists above you, beyond you, somewhere you are not. Even the most mystical forms of prayer retain a gap. The one praying and the one being prayed to remain two distinct entities. The relationship is real, but it is a relationship between separate parties. And that gap, that ontological distance, is precisely what religious institutions have historically been built to manage, to mediate, to monetize. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening, just saying. The monad call collapses the gap. Not by pretending the gap doesn't feel real, the Gnostic texts are deeply serious about the experience of forgetting, of being lost in the material world, of the divine spark existing in a state of dormancy. The Sethian texts are full of descriptions of the soul in a kind of amnesia, unable to remember its source, unable to feel the light it's made of. That experience of separation is taken completely seriously. But the diagnosis is different. The separation isn't ontological. It isn't real at the deepest level of what you are. It is experiential. It is the result of what the Gnostic tradition calls the forgetfulness cast by the demiurge and the archons, the false gods of the material system who benefit from your not recognizing what you actually are. So the monad call isn't a reaching outward towards something distant. It is a turning inward towards something that was never actually absent. The trimorphic protanoia describes this movement repeatedly. The divine voice descending into the world, not from above, but from within, calling the scattered sparks back to recognition of their origin. I am the one who is within all. That phrase, that specific claim, that is the axis of the entire practice. Now, here's the analogy that finally cracked it open for me, and I'll tell you how I arrived at it in a moment, because I want to be precise about where it came from. Imagine a speaker broadcasting a signal in a room. The signal is continuous. It never stops. It fills the entire space. But if your radio is tuned to a different frequency, or if it's generating so much static of its own that it can't lock on, you don't hear the signal. Not because the signal is absent, because you're not calibrated to receive it. The monad call, as I understand it from the texts, is less like sending a message and more like removing the static. Less like reaching toward a signal and more like allowing the receiver to stop generating interference long enough to hear what's already broadcasting. The question, then, is what generates the static? And the Gnostic tradition has a very specific answer to that. It is identification with the constructed self, the personality, the fears, the social roles, the accumulated layer of material identity that the archons use as the lens through which you perceive yourself. When you are fully identified with that layer, you experience yourself as separate from the monad, not because you are separate, because you are looking through a filter that produces the experience of separation. The monad call is the act of stepping behind that filter. I want to tell you exactly how this video came to exist, because it didn't start as a planned episode. It started with something that happened in my house about 3 weeks before I started writing this, and it shook me in a way that I haven't quite been able to set down. Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why I started the Gnostic newsletter, a free newsletter where I go deeper into esoteric Gnostic teachings, hidden wisdom, and the mysteries we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive a Gnostic guide to mastering reality as a welcome gift, completely free. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. And what happened is this. I had been deep in research on the monad call for about 2 weeks at that point. I had spent a full night, I'm not exaggerating, I didn't sleep, just moving through the Apocryphon of John, the trimorphic protanoia, and back into sections of Pistis Sophia that deal with the recognition practices described for the soul returning to the pleroma. I was trying to understand what the actual interior mechanics were. Not the cosmology, I had that. But what does a person do with this information in the privacy of their own experience? What is the felt movement of it? I had arrived at what I thought was a fairly clear understanding. The monad call, as best I could reconstruct it from the texts, involves a specific withdrawal of attention from the layer of constructed identity, the ego layer, the personality mask, and a redirection of that attention toward whatever remains when those layers are not being actively sustained. Not emptiness, something more like a prior witnessing, a noticing that is there before the contents of experience arise. The texts point toward that. They describe it as the light that precedes the emanations, the silence before the divine voice speaks. So I tried it. I'm not going to dramatize what happened. I want to be precise about what happened. I sat quietly for about 20 minutes, following the interior movement the texts seemed to be describing. And something shifted. Not externally, internally. Not a vision, not a sound. Something more like the way a room feels different when the background hum of a refrigerator you didn't consciously notice suddenly stops. A quality of stillness that you recognize only once it's there, because before it arrived, you didn't know it was missing. I tried to articulate that to my wife afterward. She's not on the Gnostic path. She was raised in a completely different tradition, has no particular interest in Nag Hammadi texts, and has listened to me talk about this material for years with a patient kind of tolerance that I genuinely appreciate. I didn't want to color it by explaining what I was trying to describe, so I just asked her if she'd be willing to try something, a kind of interior focus exercise, without me telling her what it was or what it was supposed to produce. She agreed. And I gave her the most stripped-down, context-free version of the instruction I could manage. Something like, sit quietly, and instead of focusing on a thought, a feeling, or an object of attention, try to find what's doing the noticing. Not what you're noticing, the noticing itself, and stay with that for as long as you can. She sat with it for maybe 15 minutes. When she opened her eyes, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, and I wrote this down immediately because I knew I was going to want to remember it, she said, "It felt like the part of me that usually talks was sitting in a room, and I stepped out of the room and realized the room wasn't actually me." I didn't tell her she had just described something structurally identical to what the Apocryphon of John calls the movement of the divine spark recognizing itself prior to the emanated forms. I just nodded and wrote it down. But that's what she described. The constructed self, the room. The witness prior to the constructed self, the stepping out. The recognition that the room was never the totality. That's the monad call, not the word. The experience the word points to. And here is what that means. It means the experience itself isn't esoteric. It isn't gated behind years of study, behind the right lineage, behind initiation into the correct school. The texts use highly specific cosmological language to describe something that a person with no context for any of it can arrive at with a straightforward instruction. My wife proved that in 15 minutes in our living room with zero background in Gnostic cosmology. That's not a minor point. That is the central claim of the entire tradition. That the divine spark doesn't require external instruction to recognize itself. It requires only that the constructed layers stop dominating attention long enough for the recognition to occur. The instruction doesn't create the experience. It clears the way for something that was already there. Now, here's where it gets cosmically significant, because the question of why this tradition was suppressed so violently becomes much clearer once you understand what the practice actually produces. There's a detail from the historical record that I keep coming back to, and I came back to it again while I was putting this video together because it lands differently once you understand what the monad call actually produces as an interior experience. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures of the early Christian period, wrote his 5-volume treatise Adversus Haereses, Against Heresies. He dedicated substantial portions of it to attacking the Valentinian school and the Sethian Gnostic communities specifically. And the language he uses is not the language of theological disagreement. It is the language of institutional panic. He describes these communities as dangerous, not primarily because they're wrong, but because they make the church unnecessary. Read that again. He says they make the church unnecessary. Because if the divine spark is already within you, if gnosis is a direct interior recognition rather than a mediated process requiring ordained priests, sanctioned texts, and institutional structures, then the entire scaffolding of ecclesiastical authority collapses. There is nothing for the institution to manage. There is no gap to bridge, no access to gatekeep, no sequence of sacraments that only authorized officials can administer. The practitioner becomes self-sufficient at the level of their own spiritual reality. and an institution that depends on the perception of that gap for its power cannot survive the widespread transmission of a practice that dissolves it. This is why, when I covered the demiurge in depth in my video, "This is the last video you'll ever need about the demiurge, no BS," I kept returning to the same underlying structural question: who benefits from the cosmology you inherited? Because the demiurge isn't just a theological concept. In Gnostic terms, the demiurge represents the pattern of false authority, the claim of ultimate power by an entity that is not, in fact, the ultimate source. And that pattern doesn't stay confined to cosmology. It replicates in institutions. It replicates in any structure that positions itself as the necessary mediator between you and something you actually already have access to. The Valentinian school, one of the most sophisticated Gnostic lineages, producing figures like Valentinus himself, who according to historical accounts came within a single vote of becoming Bishop of Rome, was teaching that gnosis bypasses all of that. That the recognition of the divine spark is not an institutional achievement, but an interior event. And not just any interior event. One that, as my wife demonstrated without knowing she was demonstrating anything at all, is structurally accessible to anyone willing to follow the interior movement the texts describe. When an institution moves to suppress something, not by refuting it intellectually, but by physically destroying the texts, disbanding the communities, and making adherents punishable, that is not the behavior of an institution confident in its arguments. That is the behavior of an institution that understands it cannot survive the argument. The burning of libraries at Alexandria, the campaign against the Catharai in the 12th and 13th centuries, the systematic collection and destruction of texts that culminated in what we know was lost forever. These were not acts of theological hygiene. They were acts of power preservation. And here's what makes the Nag Hammadi discovery in 1945 so extraordinary in that context. Sometime in the 4th century, likely after the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, made the destruction of heretical texts not just ecclesiastical policy, but Roman law. Someone, we don't know who, buried 13 leather-bound codices in a sealed jar near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt. They buried them rather than burn them. They chose the ground over the fire. And they stayed there for 16 centuries, until a peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman broke the jar open looking for fertilizer and found, instead, the most significant collection of Gnostic texts ever recovered. Think about what that person, whoever buried those texts, understood. They understood that what they were preserving was too important to let die with their community. They understood that the interior reality these texts were pointing toward was not something the institution could actually destroy, only obscure. You can burn a codex. You cannot burn the experience the codex describes. And they bet, correctly as it turned out, that someone would eventually find the jar. I personally think this is the most quietly heroic act in the entire history of the Gnostic tradition. Not the debates, not the theological sophistication, not even the cosmological vision itself, but the anonymous choice to put the texts in the ground rather than let them be destroyed. Because that single act of preservation is why we can have this conversation at all. One viewer left a comment under my video about the reincarnation trap that I want to bring in here because it speaks directly to this. They wrote, "The more I understand about why this was suppressed, the more I understand what I was never supposed to find." That framing. That's exactly right. The suppression is directional. It points at something. And what it points at is precisely what the monad call is designed to access. So let's get practical. Because everything up to this point has been scaffolding, necessary scaffolding, but scaffolding. The cosmology matters. The historical stakes matter. Understanding why this was suppressed and what it was designed to produce, all of that matters. Because without it, the practice becomes just another meditation technique, another thing to try and put down. The context is what gives the interior movement its weight. But now we need to talk about what the monad call actually involves as a practice, what you do with this. I want to be clear that I am not presenting this as the only valid reconstruction. The texts don't give us a step-by-step manual. What they give us is a coherent picture of an interior orientation, and from that picture, we can identify the essential movements. So what follows is my best synthesis of what the Apocryphon of John, the Trimorphic Protanoia, the Gospel of Philip, and the broader Sethian framework are describing when they point toward the practice of recognition. The first movement is what I would call the withdrawal of identification from the constructed self. This is not suppression. You are not trying to silence thoughts or forcibly empty your mind. That approach is actually counterproductive, and the texts implicitly acknowledge this when they describe the soul's difficulty as a problem of where attention is located, not a problem of mental content existing. The thoughts, the feelings, the self-talk, the running commentary, none of that is the problem. The problem is the conviction that those things are what you fundamentally are. The first movement of the monad call is simply to notice that you are observing all of that there is something registering all of that, and that whatever is doing the registering is not the same as what is being registered. This sounds simple. It is not easy, because the pull back into identification is immediate and relentless. You notice the observer for one moment, and then a thought hooks you, and you are the thought again, inside it, believing it. The texts describe this as the Archonic pull, the gravitational force of material identification dragging the spark back into forgetfulness. I want to be honest about this. In the weeks I've been working with this material, I have found that the first movement lasts for maybe a few seconds before the pull reasserts. That's not failure. The texts actually describe this exactly. The divine spark flickers. It doesn't blaze continuously, at least not initially. The practice is the returning, not the maintaining. The second movement is what the texts call the declaration of origin. This is where the monad call becomes distinct from generic contemplative practices, because this is not simply a state of open awareness. The Sethian texts are very specific. Recognition is not passive. It involves an active affirmation of what you are. Not a petition, not grant me union with the divine, not even an aspiration, not may I come to know the monad. The declaration is present tense, identity level, and absolute. The texts frame it in language like, I am from the light, and I am the offspring of the invisible one. The Gospel of Philip says, the one who has knowledge of the truth is free. Not will be free, is free, present tense. The declaration is not creating the condition. It is recognizing a condition that already exists. This is the hinge that separates the entire Gnostic approach from what prayer does. Prayer, even sincere prayer, even mystically sophisticated prayer, tends to project the desired condition into the future or the external. May it be so. Grant me this. Bring me closer. The declaration of origin does the opposite. It collapses the future into the present and the external into the interior. I am already this. I come from this. This is what I am prior to everything that was laid over me. The third movement is what I describe as resting in the recognition rather than immediately exiting it. Because the instinct, once you've touched that prior witnessing, is to immediately think about it, to narrate it. Oh, interesting, I found the observer. And the moment you start narrating it, you've left it. You're back in the constructed self, analyzing the constructed self's brief absence. The practice involves staying, not reporting, not evaluating, not reaching for more, just remaining in the quality of recognition for whatever duration is available before the pull reasserts. Those three movements, withdrawal of identification, declaration of origin, resting in recognition, are the structural core of what the texts describe. And what my wife arrived at independently, without any of the framing. Because she found the prior witness, she felt the constructed self as a room rather than as herself, and she stayed in the recognition long enough to articulate it afterward. She performed all 3 movements without knowing there were 3 movements. That's the tradition's central claim made concrete. The practice doesn't create access to the monad. It removes the interference that makes the existing access invisible. And that's the inversion that took me the longest to actually sit with. Not the cosmology, not the demiurge, not the archons, not the emanations. I could get my head around all of that eventually through the texts. What was harder was this. The tradition isn't teaching you how to build something. It's teaching you how to stop mistaking the room for the sky. There's a line I kept returning to in the Apocryphon of John, not the famous opening, but later, where the text describes the divine spark not as something that arrives from outside, but as something that has been present and unrecognized. The suppression, in the Gnostic cosmological frame, isn't something that happens to you once at death. It's ongoing, continuous. The archons don't need to intercept you at the border of some afterlife if they've already convinced you, while you're alive, that you are the room and not the awareness the room appears in. That's the elegant part of the trap, if you want to call it that. It doesn't need to be maintained by force because it's maintained by assumption. What my wife's experience demonstrated, and I keep coming back to this because I think it's more important than any of the textual argument, is that the recognition isn't locked behind years of esoteric study. It isn't reserved for initiates. It isn't the exclusive property of people who can read Coptic or who have spent, as I have, months moving through the Nag Hammadi library piece by piece. She found the prior witness in 40 minutes on a Tuesday evening with no preparation and no framework and no name for what she was finding. She didn't arrive at something approximate. She arrived at the same structural description the texts have been pointing at for nearly 2,000 years. I want to be careful here because I know how this can sound. I'm not saying the texts are unnecessary. I'm not saying study doesn't matter. I'm saying something more specific. The texts point at something real. And what they point at is accessible enough that a person with no exposure to the tradition can encounter it through direct inquiry, describe it in language that maps onto the textual descriptions with striking precision, and be genuinely unsettled by what they find. Not because it's frightening, but because it's unfamiliar in a way that doesn't feel foreign. It feels like being reminded of something you already knew and had forgotten to notice. That's the word the Gnostic tradition uses, actually. Not discovery, remembrance, anamnesis, the unforgetting. The idea that gnosis isn't the acquisition of external information, but the interior recognition of something the constructed self has been successfully obscuring. She used the phrase, forgotten to notice. I hadn't used that phrase. I hadn't led her toward it. It came out of her experience directly. And when I read it back against the framework of what I've been studying, it lands exactly where the tradition says it should land. I personally think this is the most significant thing I've covered on this channel. Not the most dramatic, not the most cosmologically elaborate, but the most significant. Because it shifts the question. It stops being a question about whether these ancient texts are historically accurate or theologically sound. It becomes a question about whether what they're pointing at is real. And her experience, unprompted, uncurated, arriving independently at the same phenomenological territory, is the most concrete answer to that question I've encountered. Not because one person's experience proves a cosmology, but because the convergence itself is data. When two people approach the same interior territory through entirely different routes and arrive at descriptions that match in structure, in quality, in the specific disorientation of finding a witness behind the witness, that's not coincidence, that's cartography. Different travelers, same geography. So, here's where I want to leave you. Stop asking whether you can reach the monad. Start questioning what it would mean if the monad were already present, already the ground of the awareness you're using right now to follow this sentence, and the only reason it appears absent is that you've been trained to identify with the room rather than with what the room appears in. The monad call is not a ritual for bridging a gap. It's an act of recognition that the gap was always the illusion. You weren't made to reach for the source from a distance. You were made as the source, temporarily convinced of distance. If this video landed somewhere real for you, let me know by commenting, "I remembered." That's all. 2 words. Because that's what this is about, not learning something new, recognizing something you never actually stopped being.